Ah, eating again, eh? I never dreamed that I'd become so accustomed to pizza as I have here and other notable things, but let me welcome you to the ARCO Forum. It is a great pleasure to do that on behalf of the Institute of Politics. And this is a critically urgent and important topic of the commercial trafficking in women. I think this is a most appropriate thing for International Women's Day, and I think there is no more appropriate time to be talking about such an issue. Do we have? Oh yes, here, Louise, come on over here. They're trying to trick you. That's it. Louise Slaughter and I have been on the stage together down in Washington at the arena stage. We've done some benefits. We're very good.
Then he broke up the act.
And then we broke up the act, but we were good when we were doing it for free too, and making money for what was that?
I don't know.
I don't either, but it was a charity.
They didn't even invite us to dinner.
They never invited us back. That's another story. Let me say one other thing. I have a guest, Ann and I have a guest tonight, Judy Hope here, who, if you really want to know about the successes of women, then remember that Judy Hope is the first woman who ever served on the Harvard Corporation board for 360 years. How about that one? 360 years, the Harvard Corporation, that's the biggest cats in the jungle, never had a woman as a member of the corporation board, and she is, I think, the sole one, no, two now. And Judy has been part of the corporation, the Harvard Corporation board for 10 years, and a lovely friend. And we know how that goes here in an institution. You remember what Churchill said? He said, "The cock croweth, but the hen delivereth the goods." That always meant a great deal to me, especially living with Ann for 45 years, and she reminds me of that. But today is International Women's Day, and there is no more appropriate time to be talking of this issue. We have assembled a most impressive cast as we delve into this complicated issue, and tonight's discussion will be extremely informative for us all. It'll be the usual procedure. We will hear from each of our panelists, and at the end of the discussion, we'll open the floor for questions. Last week and a couple times before that, I neglected the ground rule. Please give your name and your class when you step to the microphone or ask questions, or whatever that may be. That's up to the moderator. I'll leave all that to the moderator. Perhaps there aren't any. I don't.
That's the right rule.
The right rule. So it's a pleasure to introduce the Kennedy School's own Adams professor of political leadership and democratic values, Jane Mansbridge. Professor Mansbridge will be tonight's moderator, and I shall leave the introduction to Professor Adams. And we're very pleased to host this forum, and we welcome you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think we will deliver some goods tonight. So I want to welcome you. As part of International Women's Day, the forum presents Global Trafficking, the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Women and Girls. It's co-sponsored by the Women's Leadership Project, the Kennedy School's Human Rights Initiative, the Women's Student Association, and the Women in Public Policy Program, and the Institute's Student Advisory Committee. I've been asked to make a short announcement before we begin. That there'll be a film tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. entitled Peaceful Coexistence. It's directed by Albert Wandago, and it features African women from the Sudan, Angola, and Kenya speaking about their roles in peacemaking, women's roles in peacemaking in Africa, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in Lit Tower 150, followed by a discussion on women in conflict. I thought that it would be best if I introduced all of our speakers together, so then the continuity of what they say will not be interrupted by my listing all their many accomplishments. But we do have a wonderful group with us today, and they will speak in alphabetical order, which is also the order that you have on your program. Samia Burney is the Asia researcher for the Women's Rights Division of Human Rights Watch. That's the largest human rights monitoring organization based in the United States. On behalf of the Women's Rights Division, she's investigated and reported on violations of women's human rights in Asia and has worked with women's organizations in the region and around the world to improve the protection of women's rights. Her human rights investigations have targeted violations of women's human rights, including state failure to prosecute violence against women. In her 4 years at Human Rights Watch, Ms. Burney has also served as advocate for the Women's Rights Division, raising women's human rights concerns with abusive governments, as well as with policymakers in the United States and the United Nations. For the advancement of women's concerns in the international justice arena, Ms. Burney has also participated in treaty negotiations for the establishment of an international criminal court. Her writing includes Bangladesh, Political Violence on All Sides, and a forthcoming report on violence against women in Pakistan. Then we'll hear from Laura Lederer, who is the director of what we call the Protection Project. That's one of the projects of the Women in Public Policy program here at the Kennedy School. She'll tell you about that. With a degree, a JD in law from the DePaul College of Law, she has also been awarded, is the recipient of the 1997 Annual Award for Outstanding Work on Human Rights from the Gustavus Mayers Center for the Study of Human Rights in North America. She's written extensively on speech issues and on trafficking, including most recently national legislation on an international trafficking in child pornography, which will be published by the U.S. Department of Justice this coming spring. And then we will hear from Marcia Liss, who is a trial attorney in the Child Exploitation and Obscenity section of the Criminal Division, U.S. Department of Justice. Ms. Liss oversees the Child Prostitution Initiative. That's a project aimed at stemming the trafficking of youth for prostitution in the United States. Ms. Liss also has responsibility for the international activities of the section involving trafficking of women and youth for prostitution and the travel of Americans for criminal sexual activity with minors. She works with other executive branch departments and with non-governmental organizations and professional associations on issues of child exploitation. She received her PhD in developmental psychology from the State University of New York at Stony Brook and a JD from the University of California at Los Angeles. So she combines both law and psychology as well as work in the government. Then we'll hear from Frederick Schauer, our own academic dean, and Fred Stanton Professor of the First Amendment here at the Kennedy School. Schauer teaches and writes on many issues, including free speech and the relationship between law, ethics, and policymaking. He holds a JD from Harvard, and before coming to the Kennedy School, he was professor of law at the University of Michigan. He's the author of The Law of Obscenity and Free Speech, A Philosophical Inquiry, and many other books and important articles, including articles on the issue of pornography. He's been working on issues of violence in the media, sexual violence, pornography, child pornography, and obscenity since the 1970s. He was a commissioner of the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography in 1985-86. So he brings a depth of expertise also. And then finally, we're very privileged to have with us Congresswoman Slaughter, who is serving her 7th term in the U.S. House of Representatives. She's representing the 28th Congressional District of New York State, which includes the city of Rochester and most of its suburbs. She's been described as one of the most powerful women in Congress. She sits on the influential House Rules Committee and on its subcommittee on rules and organization of the House. She's vice chairwoman of the Research Committee of the Democratic Leadership, and she serves as whip at large. In her 12 years in the House, Congresswoman Slaughter has earned a reputation as a strong proponent of progressive causes. A bacteriologist with a master's degree in public health, she's intensely involved in health issues, especially those affecting women. She has, for example, won historic increases in funding for women's health. She fought for legislation guaranteeing that women and minorities are included in all federal health trials, and establishing an Office of Research on Women's Health at the National Institutes of Health. She's responsible for the passage of legislation that established the first federal research and education programs on DES. That's that drug prescribed to pregnant women from 1938 to 1971, and the mistaken notion that it would prevent miscarriage. But in fact, it often caused deformities and other health problems in the reproductive systems of the children. In an effort to reduce crime and promote justice at home and abroad, Congresswoman Slaughter has introduced a measure seeking to reduce the global trafficking in women and girls for the purpose of sexual and other forms of exploitation. She is the point person in Washington on this issue. She is a leading advocate of women's rights. We have a wonderful collection of people here. I urge you to welcome them, and we look forward to an exciting panel.
Good evening. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to be here today. In fact, having spent the last 3 hours stuck in an airplane, my plane was delayed for like 2 hours. It's particularly delightful to be in such a spacious room. But I guess in view of the time constraints, I didn't realize we had such a short time to speak. I'll just give a brief overview of some of the main elements of trafficking that we've encountered in our investigations in several countries. And I'll also outline some of the challenges that the problem of trafficking poses for crafting an adequate state response to it. First of all, I'd like to stress that trafficking is a distinct phenomenon from illegal migration, although trafficking victims and illegal migrants face a lot of similar abuses that need to be addressed in tandem. However, the term trafficking itself covers a range of scenarios in which women are abducted, coerced, or tricked into migrating to work in a number of sectors, including prostitution, which is the most well-known sex trafficking. But trafficked victims are also coerced or tricked into working in domestic service or sweatshop labor of various types, such as garment manufacturing most commonly. Now, the coercion that is sort of the root of the process of trafficking takes many forms. The coercion could take the form of violence, intimidation, debt bondage, but most frequently it's deception or fraud as to the type of the work or the terms and conditions that the work would entail. But the goal of traffickers, the underlying rationale behind trafficking is always the same, which is to exploit the women's labor and to benefit from it financially. Like in a common scenario that we've encountered several times in our research on trafficking, recruiters lure women with promises of good jobs with high pay in the destination country, but upon arrival, the women are faced with very different jobs. Either the jobs are different in terms of their nature, the type of job, or else the actual employment terms and conditions are different from what the women had been led to believe. In both situations, however, the women end up in abusive conditions with no control over their work and also no control over debts that are frequently imposed on them, ostensibly to cover travel fees and living expenses. And the traffickers are able to control the women's employment and to exploit their labor precisely because they have transported these women into an unfamiliar and hostile milieu. And here the women are marginalized, they're socially and linguistically isolated, they have no links, and they're very uncertain of their rights and status in the receiving country. So traffickers can use a variety of means, such as saying that, if you run off, then the police is going to get you and imprison you, and you'll be deported and harassed. So it's because of the fact that women are taken into this, transported across borders, taken to new countries where they are completely unconnected, that they are particularly vulnerable. And in this way, the traffickers get the supply of vulnerable workers with no bargaining power, with no legal recourse, and they can operate outside of normally applicable frameworks of contractual laws, criminal laws, or labor protections. And in this way, they manage to maximize their profits. Now, what efforts to combat this global problem should look like is really a very complex question. And the answer to this, I don't think, is clear to anyone, really. We've been working on the issue for a long time, and the complexity, our understanding keeps getting more and more complex, and it's very hard to craft a simple response to it. But there are certain elements, a few basic elements that we feel should be part of any government or state response to the problem of trafficking. And an absolutely basic thing is that any response to trafficking must have two prongs, not just a law enforcement prong, but you have to have a second prong to ensure to basically to provide services to the trafficked women, and to ensure their security and due process rights. So at the same time as you empower police and you establish procedures to effectively prosecute and punish traffickers, you have to pay attention to the needs of the victims as well. Up till now, the international response has mostly focused on the law enforcement side, stepping up law enforcement efforts against trafficking, and this without a simultaneous attention to rights protections for victims often proves detrimental to the victims themselves. For example, in our work on the United States and in certain other countries too, we found that law enforcement officials don't even quite understand the nature of trafficking or the realities that trafficking victims face. And they tend to treat trafficked victims as criminals or as illegal aliens. And also, so often when trafficking victims come into contact with law enforcement, they're summarily deported, and that denies them the opportunity to consider bringing a civil suit against their traffickers for damages or for violation of their civil rights, and or they're also denied an opportunity to consider trying to launch legal proceedings to claim back wages and compensation that is owed to them. And it's only women who are designated material witnesses usually who tend to escape summary deportation. But even women who become designated material witnesses in prosecutions against traffickers and, say, brothel employers, even they are detained often in prison facilities during the course of the trial, because they don't have connections and they don't have resources to be able to post bond for their release. So this shows that just strengthening law enforcement crackdowns on brothels and sweatshops is not going to protect the victims from human rights violations. And the other thing to note in this context is that frequently state officials themselves are complicit in trafficking, and they aid and abet brothel owners. They seize passports from trafficking victims, so they, in several ways, they're complicit in trafficking. So we feel that an integral part of any effort to combat trafficking has to be the provision of protective and support services for the trafficked women in state custody. And these sorts of services would include shelter, legal and medical assistance, and also temporary residence to give them time to explore the feasibility of bringing various forms of civil proceedings against their traffickers. Another thing that we feel is imperative in efforts to combat trafficking is legal reform at the national level. It's national laws really that are the place of first recourse for most trafficking victims. And in the US in particular, as well as in certain other parts of the world, we've studied the legal regime in the US with particular attention. And the laws need to be reformed at several levels. For example, the laws that govern involuntary servitude and debt bondage, which is the condition that many trafficked women end up in, need a serious reform, as well as laws governing prostitution, laws governing immigration, and laws governing the treatment of material witnesses, because none of these laws taken as a whole are responsive to the needs of trafficked women. And as a result, trafficked women get treated more like returnable goods, collect them, and send them back where they came from, rather than victims of human rights abuses. And in conclusion, I'd just like to say that traffickers have been increasingly targeting women, and this is mostly, well, in part, this is because women in many parts of the world have unequal access to education and unequal access to better paying employment. And so any long-term strategy to combat trafficking has got to tackle various forms of discrimination against women. I guess I'll end there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Now Laura Lederer will give us an overview of the project.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to have Samia go first to talk a little bit about what happens to women and children who are trafficked. I'm going to talk about the Protection Project, a research project here at the Kennedy School of Government in the Women in Public Policy program. The project is a response to this increasing trafficking of women and children, and an effort to address one of the main problems which Samia mentioned, which is that the trafficking is international, but the legislation is all national. There's no international legislation that has teeth in it, that has enforcement capability. There are UN conventions, but there isn't that enforcement capability. So we need to know what the laws are in various countries if we want to help women and children while we're going about changing the laws and making them better. What are they right now? And the Protection Project is an effort to document the laws in all 220 countries and territories. Just to give you an example, recently there were several dozen women trafficked from Thailand to the U.S. In San Diego. Then they were driven up across the U.S. And over the border into Canada, where they were placed in a brothel. They were arrested there under the Canadian 1920s bawdy house laws. What are those laws? How do they work? We don't know. We need to have the statutes here in front of us in a place they're readily accessible so that we can begin to, so that we can use them to help women. The Protection Project will provide that information and we hope more. The long title of the project is Creating an International Framework for Legislation to Protect Women and Children from Commercial Sexual Exploitation. We call it the Protection Project for short. Over the last year, we've had a dozen researchers contacting the ministries of justice in the 220 countries and territories. We sent out 2 questionnaires so far. The first one on sexual trafficking and prostitution. The second one on child pornography, and sexual exploitation in cyberspace. And then there's a third one yet to come. To date, we've received about 170 responses back, and we're working on the last 50 in the hopes that we can get as near to possible 100% return rate. The survey instrument will allow us for the first time to document the laws on prostitution, child prostitution, pimping, pandering, procuring, trafficking and forced prostitution, extradition laws, extraterritoriality laws, and other cross-jurisdictional issues. We're also documenting the range of penalties, defenses to the charges. In other words, if a charge is brought against somebody, do they have a defense against that charge? The sentencing patterns, reporting requirements, and victim assistance programs. As Samia says, there are the 3 Ps, protection, prevention, and prosecution. And there are some countries that are developing more model legislation that have programs of assistance for victims, and we're documenting those also. We're looking also in the third questionnaire at the more human aspects. And the first two questionnaires were aimed specifically at the statutes, at what the legislation is right now. The third questionnaire is going to ask questions about the health aspects, the labor, immigration problems related to trafficking, and also ask governments to assess the scope of the problem in their own countries so that we will have, again, for the first time, at least some basic figures to work with. Till now, most of the information we have is anecdotal information, and we want to, the survey will allows us to ask the same question to each government and get the answers back so that we can do the kind of comparative analysis that is necessary. Finally, we're also examining the age of majority, the age of marriage, age of consent to sexual relations, and other ages that are relevant to commercial sexual exploitation. And these are important because every country has a different definition of a child right now. The Convention on the Right to the Child mandates a definition of a child. The child comes of age at 18, but until that convention has been implemented, many countries have various ages of majority. For instance, in Tanzania, it's 12, and in some countries, it's 14. And these ages make a difference when you're talking about the laws against child prostitution and child pornography, for instance. The final products of the Protection Project will be, among others, a database that will present the worldwide legal picture on a country-by-country basis, cross-referenced by issue area, in other words, prostitution, child pornography, cross-referenced again for the criminal codes. We translated the survey into 5 languages, German, Spanish, French, Arabic, and Russian. And all of the criminal codes and the information that the countries give us will be available in the original language as well as in English. We also hope to produce a best legislative practices manual that will look at the statutes and take the best of the best from around the world and present them in a manual that countries can use if they wish to improve their laws. And finally, a set of annotated statutes that are model legislation that can be used by legislators and public policy officials and others that wish to improve legislation in their countries. And I think I'll stop there because we have a number of other speakers, and we'll have time for questions later.
Thanks very much. And now we'll hear from Marsha Liss.
Thank you. The area of trafficking is not really a new phenomenon. The question is, what is happening that is new in it? And what we are using in the Justice Department starts with some very old tools from the beginning of this century. What was formerly called, and actually in the books, if you still look at it, it does still say the White Slave Trade Act, the Mann Act. These are some of the words that are still there. And over the course of time, these have been changed from what were very gender specific and only about women. They are now gender neutral. We have special passages that apply with increased penalties and provisions about trafficking of minors. We have other provisions that have been added that we use in tandem on alien smuggling, especially alien smuggling for prostitution. And we have other kinds of things about passport fraud, which is where some of the trafficking cases actually start. There are a lot of these things that we have been given by Congress as our tools to see what can we do with. And these have been very important for us. And in addition, over the years, these have expanded from being somewhat provincial and used domestically about women traveling into the Wild West to actually being cases about international trafficking as well. Let me stop before I go on to the international cases. I want to say something about our domestic cases. And that's very important because we can't forget about the fact that American youth are trafficked across this country by pimps and recruiters for prostitution. And we need to address these as well because many of the girls on the street are as young as 12, 13, and 14 years age. They may be your neighbors, they could be your daughters, your sisters, or someone you went to school with. So these are things that we really need to consider. And we have been working in an increased effort in this regard. And I want to just mention 2 brief cases about them. One, that was a conviction in Las Vegas, and no one thought we'd ever get a conviction against trafficking for prostitution in Las Vegas, but we have. And we got a 20-year sentence against a man who took 2 girls. Those were the only 2 we were able to charge him on, but we know he was a long-term career person. He had narcotics violations in the past. He had weapons violations in the past. And right here in the District of Massachusetts, we recently had a conviction of a guy by the name of Troy Footman, who is awaiting sentencing for trafficking more than 2 girls around the country. He too was charged on 18 counts of trafficking with numerous other charges and has a long criminal history. So this is part of our backdrop to realize that this is an American domestic problem as well as an international problem. And some of the issues that Sammy mentioned about the victims' issues are as critical. Where can they go? If they were easily trafficked and lured away from home, we can't send them back home, can we? Or where else can we put them? What are the resources we have? What are the services we need in our communities for these girls as well as our international trafficked girls? In the international scene, we have had a very strong program in the last few years, and these have been brought to us very often by law enforcement, and some of them have been brought to us as starting from the non-governmental community. And this is a partnership that we see as something very important for the next few years. One of the cases a couple of years ago is a case that we call the Bowery Brothel case. It was a case involving the trafficking of Thai women into lower Manhattan, and it started accidentally. It was, and when it came and was finished, we have a conviction of several defendants serving long-term sentences, and we actually have someone in our midst who worked on that case. Thank you, Dan, for being here this evening. I think accidentally, but it's wonderful to have you here. We have had in the past few years some very interesting new themes. We had women recruited from Czechoslovakia to come to the United States to work as hostesses, but they didn't think that a hostess meant that they would have to dance nude and be touched by the patrons. That was a conviction in New York City, another place where people said, you'll never get a trafficking conviction, they tolerate a lot. Wrong. They don't tolerate a lot, just like they don't tolerate a lot in Las Vegas or in Boston. We also had a case recently in Florida, a Mexican case involving girls and women who were trafficked from Mexico into South Florida, where they were set up in a number of brothels. And one of the difficulties there in our getting access to the women had to do with the fact that the only people who could go in would be other Mexicans. And that included the customers, that included the women, that included anyone who was managing the place. So we had to use a lot of ingenuity, but thankfully that too is one that was a family operation. Some of the family members were still in Mexico, some of them are here. We have massage parlor cases coming out of the District of Hawaii, no fewer than 3 of them in the past year, involving women from China and the Philippines and Thailand. Sonia mentioned a very interesting question about whether or not we can use wage and hour issues, whether we can use labor discrimination and involuntary servitude. And that is a new direction that we have taken, starting with a case that began in an American Commonwealth, a little bit far from here, but still a very good model for us, that started with a labor case called the Japanese Enterprise case in the Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas, which is probably as far as you can get from Boston and still be in an American property. And there, in that case, there were some women who had been trafficked in originally for the garment industry. And as that garment case was going on, we realized that there were also sexual exploitation violations. And from some of their testimony, we opened up an entire new area of realizing how can we combine going from one kind of a case to a second kind of case. And in that case, we actually did the wage discrimination before we turned to the sexual exploitation. But that has led to no fewer than 4 in a very small island. I was there recently. It is, I believe, a 13 by 5 mile island, and no fewer than 4 sexual trafficking cases in the past year. Well, where are we going now? Well, we've been infused with a great deal of new energy in the past year, starting on International Women's Day last year on March 11th, when the President gave a directive to the entire executive branch to take another look. What else can we do? How can we push a little further and come up with some more innovative approaches to this issue of trafficking of women, both domestically and internationally? Women meaning, by the way, there are maybe some young men involved, there may be children, but using that as a generic phrase. What we've had come out of that are several very important working groups. One is a DOJ working group, just within the department, that takes the criminal division, civil rights division, and we have been preparing a report for the Attorney General in which we talk about all the many needs that we have. And we'll have to see where those needs goes and how many of them get answered by the resources that will become available. We have an interagency working group headed by the President's Interagency Council on Women, which is housed in the State Department, that is working on multidisciplinary approaches to trafficking. What do the human services people have to tell us? or the transportation people have to tell us. How can we put all of these together? And there is also a worker exploitation task force that is addressing the very issues of the civil rights violations, and that is based actually in the Civil Rights Division, the issues of deception of employment. What are people really coming from? What does it mean to answer an ad saying you're going to be a waitress? And why would you have to have that amount of money that you then pay off in order to get that job? What Samia was referring to is the debt bondage. What is that all about? How do we stop these issues? One of the interesting things we're doing in the interagency working group is to work with some of our colleagues in the European Union and in the Ukraine and in Poland on training programs as well as education programs. And one of the innovations there has been an information program for women applying for visas. Here are some things you may want to think about. If things don't turn out the way you thought, where might you go? What hotline numbers might you want to have? How can we use domestic violence hotlines to have reports for some of these issues of the abuse of women? In the cases that I mentioned to you, especially in the brothel cases, more than even in some of the others, most of the women are beaten. Most of the women are raped by the people who have trafficked them, and they have no will to resist. What can we do? What kind of services can we have? So we're taking a multi-pronged approach now, looking at international training, helping our law enforcement colleagues, by the way, in other countries, understand what it means to look for the evidence. How can they go back and help us obtain telephone records that support the issues of communications and trafficking? How can they help us identify what is a valid visa and maybe a fraudulent one? How can they help us identify birth certificates and ages of the individuals that we have? This is a very important area because if we try and do it alone, we're not going to be nearly as successful as if we can work with our colleagues in other countries. Another area, in addition to the training, is our relationship with the non-governmental community. And this is an important one in terms of identification of victims, as has happened in a few of our cases, and the provision of services. That is something that many of them may be as equipped to do more than we are equipped to do. And the other area that we look forward to is to find out what new tools we may have to use the tools that we've had, but what new ones and what new resources may our colleagues over in other areas be able to give us for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Fred Schauer.
I want to talk mostly about a dimension of the protection project that Laura didn't talk about, and we divided up the way we would talk about the project. But let me, by way of preface, just talk for a minute or two about pornography and about the references in all of the previous speakers and in the definition of the problem to pornography. There are, as we all know, certainly in this country and to some extent in other countries, important policy and legal debates about controlling images, about films, about books, about magazines, about videotapes, about the internet, about cyberspace, and about the effect of pornography on its users in all of these domains. These are important debates. In an important way, however, they are not the issue that we are talking about here. Far less controversial than the question of pornography and its effect on those who use it is the question of participation. The children who are in child pornography are not, by any plausible definition of the term, consenting adults. Much the same can be said about the women who are in pornography, even non-child pornography. In a very large number of instances, those who are seen in pornographic images in various different media are under even the narrowest conception of coercion coerced. It may be physical force, it may be the threat of physical force, it may be beatings, it may be rape, it may be others. And frequently, and especially in the United States, somebody mentions the word pornography and there is automatically an assumption of a certain kind of debate, a debate that is focused almost exclusively on the users. Some would call them watchers or viewers. I prefer users. It is certainly possible and important to have those debates, but even more important is to stress the discontinuity between those debates and the question of those who are in fact in the images, largely, although not exclusively, under circumstances of coercion. Certainly in the case of children, under most definitions, exclusively under circumstances of coercion. So at least by way of preface, I want to warn against thinking that as soon as the words pornography or child pornography are mentioned, we're talking about a certain kind of debate about the effects of images. Rather, we are talking about those who are largely coerced into being part of this enterprise. The protection project that Laura talked about to some extent, and the project in which she is the most active, most historically important participant, is a project that is, as she says, largely about cataloging, translating, collecting, analyzing, studying, modeling, and the like, the full range of laws dealing with trafficking in women, dealing with sexual exploitation. Now, one of the reasons why the project is particularly important relates to the word trafficking itself. The word traffic, although it is a word that connotes commerce, also connotes transportation, connotes something moving from one place to another. In many respects, the problem of trafficking in women is a cross-border one. Law is particularly poor at dealing with cross-border problems. There is something about the nature of law that makes it particularly indigenous, that makes it coincident with national boundaries. One of the important dimensions of this project is to try to deal with the range of issues. Laura referred correctly to extraterritoriality, the circumstances under which law might appropriately be applied to activities taking place beyond borders, to extradition problems, to international law, and a whole range of issues that are likely to arise when the problem is one that is particularly transborder or cross-border rather than the full range of legal problems. The first step of the protection project, and the largest and most important step at the moment, is this cataloging, analyzing, translating, studying, and the like, leading to, we hope, model legislation and the like. But I want to talk, just for my remaining minute or so, about the second stage of the project that we are just beginning to plan and outline now, that we haven't started to the same degree of detail. One of the vices of lawyers, and there are three of us as part of the group in front of you, is that we are often prone to think that the enactment of legislation, perhaps this is a vice of members of Congress as well, that the enactment of legislation or the decision of cases or the creation of laws of various varieties is itself a solution, or even if putting it in less harsh terms, itself is likely to be a large step towards a solution to the problem. One of the things that we want to do in the protection project is test this, both across country, latitudinally, and over time, longitudinally, examine the relationship between laws of different varieties and the extent of trafficking and the extent to which laws of one variety rather than another, laws of a certain content rather than another, laws enforced in certain ways rather than another, have variable effects on the problem. Are there certain laws that may work better? Are there certain laws that are designed to be particularly, not designed to be, that are destined to be particularly ineffective? It's a daunting task. We want to therefore examine and catalog not only the nature of laws, but also the statistics and evidence that we can get about the extent and size of the problem, and try to correlate the two together, coming out of this with some sense of which legal approaches, if any, are the best approaches to dealing with the problem. Examining issues of civil versus criminal, specific versus general, and various other variations in legal style, all of which might suggest that at the end of this, once we have cataloged the 200 or so different legal approaches, we can map that against the pattern of the problem itself in the 200 or so different jurisdictions and say, maybe on the basis of this, we can say that this approach rather than that approach is likely to be most effective. If we can do that, then the model legislation, best practices that might come out at the end of this will have a solid grounding not only in the careful legal research and analysis that's now being done, but empirical reality as well. Thank you.
And now I'm very happy to introduce Congresswoman Louise Slaughter.
Thank you so much. The trafficking of women and girls nets the traffickers $7.5 billion a year that we know of. And that's organized crime, and I'd like to think of it from that aspect. When we passed the Violence Against Women Act in Washington, we talked about how we wanted for the once and for all to make sure that using the bodies of women and girls in the United States to settle old scores or angers was not going to happen here any longer. And then we saw what happened in the war in the Balkans when rape was used as an act of war. And I think as we bump up to the cusp of this next century, that we're really not getting any better at it. When I first started working on this legislation, I was looking at an entirely different aspect than what we're talking about tonight. The prostitution rings and things that happen in the United States, I feel, are at least subject to the laws of the United States, and we have a fair chance at doing something about it. However, I'm totally cognizant of the women in the sweatshop in California who were there for months and months before anybody found them, and they had no place to go, and that came as quite a shock to me. And I think that when we really started first working about the trafficking of women, that we did not recognize it as being a problem in this country at all. As a matter of fact, the first thing that concerned me was when it came to my attention about the little girls in Thailand. And Julie Cashin, who's a student here, worked in my office, and she knows that I have got an overabundance of the genes that sort of say, I wish I could do something about that. And so my office springs into action there, and I pick up new things like lint. This one really struck me so badly because I'm sure you're perfectly aware of it. Little girls as young as 5, 6, 7 years old were sold by their parents out in the rural areas into Thailand and other countries to use for sex trips for men who believed that they were pure and didn't have AIDS. And they were sold by their parents, which is a whole new wrinkle of what we're talking about. What do we do when the parent themselves give this child away? And we also found out that in many cases, as Sammy pointed out, the police agencies ran the brothels. And the government knew about it, and when little girls would try to find their way back home, they would go find them and bring them back. About 1987, 88, I started visiting the countries of Europe as a member of the Helsinki Commission and talked about it to the women parliamentarians of Europe and what are we going to do about sex trafficking of women. And it didn't seem to be a European problem either, we thought, until we got the statistic that there were something like 250,000 women moved across Europe a day for sexual purposes. After the problems happened in Belgium with little girls, if you remember, were kidnapped and buried and hidden away, one of my best friends, who's a member of the parliament in Belgium, and I started working on this with some rights and passed legislation through the Helsinki Commission that rape is a war crime and that we would no longer tolerate this trafficking. But as you point out, the laws are pretty toothless. And while we all go back and say, we'd really like to pass this, I have been flacking this piece of legislation in the Congress and the House of Representatives, I think, for about, 8 years, I think. And all I can tell you is I can't pass it. It simply is not a problem. People simply don't see it as what it is, a thing that is growing daily. Let me give you a description of what the trafficking means. Now, the most common use that we think of is coerced sexual exploitation, but it's more than that. Taken by itself, the Lord knows that's egregious enough. But we have to know there are additional crimes equally as offensive, and they include the recruitment, the transport, harboring, and sale of persons within national or across international borders for purposes that include not only forced prostitution, but sexual slavery, sweatshop labor, and domestic servitude. I didn't think any panel in the United States would be talking about those things right up to on to the 21st century. Now, as we work to address it through some law enforcement and what we can do in the United States, I think we have to keep that broader definition in mind. And everybody's pointed out how the women get recruited. There's a very serious problem with the women of Ukraine who literally have no way to make a living in their country. And they see the ad in the newspaper, or somebody tells them that you can get a great job going into Germany, you're going to work in a restaurant. To be the word hostess, as you point out, has only no connotation to them exactly what that means. Some of them think that they're going to be hostesses in restaurants. And they are bought down into those countries and made to pay their own way, and said, we are going to force you to stay here and work off what you owe us. It's impossible for them to do it. There is no way they can, because oftentimes if they get close to paying off the owner, the slaveholder, they could be sold to somebody else and they start the same sorry thing again. But all over the world right now, criminal organizations are capitalizing on the poverty and the unemployment and the disintegration of social networks to exploit and abuse women and children. Now, usually the countries have experienced a breakdown in the social and political and economic institutions. It's evident in the fact that a large percentage of trafficked women and children originate from Southeast Asia, as well as from most of the former Soviet republics. Faced with those difficult times in their own countries, they don't have much of an opportunity to do anything but to be lured into this service. What they hope for is what all of us hope for, to make enough money to take care of their families and to fulfill their dreams. But what they find is hell on earth. And dreams turn into nightmares. They have no place to go because their passports are taken away from them. They are sold again for profit. They are forced to sell their bodies, as I said, to cover the cost of a debt that they didn't incur. And the intimidation and the constant monitoring and the supervision prevent them from escaping. In some cultures, there is no place for them to go because the shame of what they have been through would prevent them from going home. But should they try to escape, the punishment includes beating, starvation, and confinement, and death. And as I pointed out, when they're close to paying it off, they have to start it again. It was especially troubling for me to learn that this problem is not isolated to the rest of the world, as I pointed out. From the discovery of the prostitution ring of trafficked women in Florida and the Carolinas, and to the Thai garment workers held captive in El Monte, California, the issue of trafficking has to be dealt with right here in our own backyard. The combination of great wealth and a lack of awareness about the issue has rendered the United States the destination of a large number of trafficked women and children. Throughout my career in Congress, as I pointed out, I've tried my best to do something about this legislation. We get a lot of people who sponsor it, but I couldn't get a hearing to save my life. And unfortunately, as I learned more and realized that it was not restricted to any other nation, it made it a little bit better for us. And we've got a new bill coming in addition to the resolution. Senator Paul Wellstone and I are going to be introducing shortly legislation to really tighten up on it. Now, I will tell you, I'd be pretty tough about it. They don't call me slaughter for nothing. I will tell you right now that I think any male, any American citizen who goes to another country to exploit a little girl for sexual gratification should lose his American passport. I don't have any problem with that at all. And frankly, I would, while I know that foreign aid is not to be used as any kind of club or anything to force people to do the things that we want to, by George, it needs to be used for something. But we need very much to stop this abhorrent practice. And I'm pleased to see what my government is doing, and I am so happy to see what Harvard's doing. I can't begin to tell you how much I'm delighted to see what Laura's doing here. And you may find some answers here. And certainly I know, because this is probably the most prestigious institution in the United States, that you can certainly get us some attention on it, and for that I'm very happy. There are a couple things that our legislation calls on. We want to address the problem from an international perspective, which is terribly important. And so we are calling on the State Department to train consular officers on the prevalence and risk of trafficking and the rights of victims, and to tell people who are coming to get a visa, you know, help them out a little bit. If this looks like a group of women who are going over all joyful thinking they'll get a job, as at least point out, we need to talk to them about that. We also want the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs to provide and expand the funding to support the criminal justice training programs, which include education on trafficking. We don't educate our police here to look for those signs and what happened, to really recognize it when they see it. And then, as important as anything, and Sammy pointed this out, we have got to give support and services to the people who have been the victims. That's been one of the problems with a lot of the laws that we've had. We say we're going to turn you loose out there, but then what? And these are people who really need some help, and we're going to have to do it. As I pointed out, we had a lot of other colleagues helping us, but nothing really got going. I'm hoping that this year that we will. But I would I think we need to look at deportation laws. We haven't done that, I guess, since Lucky Luciano. Am I right, Senator? But maybe we ought to look at people, people who've come into the United States, naturalized citizens who then engage in this, who I think should at least be forfeited, forfeit their own citizenship. Now, we're not going after economic development. As I pointed out a while ago, I know that that does not work, and it's not the right way for us to go. But I will point out one more time that the seeds of this horrible occurrence are poverty, unemployment, and a lack of opportunity at home. And those are the primary conditions. And if we cut the economic aid, I'm afraid we would exacerbate the problems of trafficking and not help them. The most important part is the victim, and we want them to be able to not be deported for a prescribed amount of time, the victims that is. We want a grace period for them to help them to avoid returning to their home countries in a condition that would make them susceptible to being entrapped all over again. At the same time, they can stay here to testify against the criminals who brought them here. In addition, it will provide assistance to the victims here and abroad, including mental and physical services and shelters similar to the battered women shelters that we have. Finally, we'll require that law enforcement, immigration officials, and foreign service officers be trained in dealing with and protecting trafficking victims rather than simply prosecuting them for crimes that they were forced to commit. We need to address this issue immediately. And as long as these are still occurring, I think we need to commit ourselves to make sure that we'll do what we can to stop it. But they will be in vain if the other nations don't pass similar laws to ours. And as I pointed out, as a member of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, we will be working with our fellow parliamentarians overseas to try to do that. And I remained hopeful that we can help solve this problem. And then I would hope if all of you who saw the Amnesty International report that came out this week, sexual abuse of women in all American institutions, penal institutions, maybe once we fix it in the world, we can take care of home. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here with you this evening. It's a great delight to see people who care about this issue. Thank you. Thank you.
This is an incredibly important issue to bring to the public at the moment. For most of the public, this is an issue that's hidden. It's over there, not here. It's not important. But it is a crucial issue, and we have to think about it carefully. We've got to exercise moral leadership, and we have to get other nations to join with the United States in attacking what, once you think about it, is a deep moral wrong. Now, because it's complex, I hope that there will be probing questions from the audience. We need to ask the questions from one of the two microphones because there will be this is being recorded, and no matter how loud your voice is, you must go to the microphones to ask questions. And please identify yourself with your name and affiliation before asking a question. And we'd like it too if you ask questions rather than making statements. So please, the first question.
My name is Mimi Goss, and I teach at the Kennedy School. I know that a lot of your work is just preliminary, and there's not a lot of consensus internationally at this point, but I'm wondering if we can't withhold foreign aid, when you're dealing with a dictatorship, and there's trafficking in a dictatorship, whether it's a federal dictatorship or a local dictatorship, what other kinds of strategies do you propose to work with these kinds of situations?
One of the issues that I've taken some comfort in this year a little bit is the issue of female genital mutilation, which we've also worked on very closely. And what we are finding is happening is that in the villages where it is practiced, in the countries where it is normal, that women and many times the chiefs and elders of the villages are deciding by education process that this is not the thing to do. All in all, I think that if we could duplicate that to some extent, I think that would be better. But we can only pass laws here. We can't do them overseas. The only recourse I have, of course, are the women in Parliament in the European countries. We don't have a counterpart for Asia, where so much of this takes place. But working with the Department of Justice, which is, I think, doing some very good job, and I'm very impressed that the United Nations is doing some talking about it now. We may begin to see some crack in this. Frankly, it's frightening to me how it has grown. But I would certainly, if nothing else, I know we give some money for police training, but the crackdown on the law enforcement in those countries is vital. I don't know how much our aid means to them. I don't know where they could get it from some other country if we were to withhold it. But I think it's terribly important that we make a statement, and I would imagine that a lot of those countries, knowing what's happening here now and that it's expanded to us, one of the first things we have to do is clean up home. And then I think we'll have better moral authority to talk to the other countries. But as I said at the outset, one of the saddest things for me, and I simply don't know what to do about that, is when parents themselves sell their young daughters into a life of hell. And that's a moral issue, again, as we pointed out, the whole thing is. I wish we were getting better as people, that we could.
Laura, would you like to
think
add a
these
word?
children could perhaps grow up with some idea of, well, Laura may have the answer.
I don't know that I have the answer, but I know there are several bills that are coming down the pike right now. Louise's is one, and there are some on the Republican side also, and they are suggesting that there are some sanctions, not necessarily humanitarian aid be withheld, but there are some types of monies that can be used as the quote-unquote club that Representative Slaughter was talking about. And I think we'll see those listed soon. So it is possible to separate out the humanitarian and economic aid that's so necessary to encourage countries to develop from other kinds of aid that we may want to use to help them to deal with this problem.
Marshall just wanted to add a word.
I just wanted to add something which goes back to something that Representative Slaughter said about the UN issues, and that is there is a new UN organized crime convention that is being worked on now with some very interesting protocol on trafficking of women and youth for a variety of purposes. And I think that's one of the things that raises to the international level for heads of states to be looking at is when the UN conventions come in that form. And so I think that's at least a consciousness level. It may mean that following that it takes a number of years for anything to happen, but at least it's a start in some direction for them.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I'm Rick Doblin, a doctoral student here focusing on drug policy. And I noticed that a lot of the language that you use, even the organizations that you mention, are involved with trying to work on the problem of drug trafficking. And I think we'll never have a world without drugs. We'll probably never have a world without prostitution. And so I'd like to know if you've been looking at any examples or if you've got any thoughts about the role of legalizing prostitution and taking the unsavory elements out of it, getting the criminal underground out of it, and better protecting the women.
Would anyone like to answer that?
I think that's for you, Laura.
This is a much larger debate that's going on in the women's movement. It's going on at the UN level, and I think it'll go on between countries. Countries are trying to decide now whether to legalize prostitution. Some are not. The basic debate is prostitution a form of labor? And as such, a right that women have, and if we just regulated it like other forms of labor, could we basically, like you're saying, clean it up? Or is it per se a violation of human rights? And is there a knot of problems of violence and drug addiction and all the other kinds of problems that societies are trying to get rid of? And those two sort of ends of the political spectrum on this are just beginning to dialogue. There's been a polarization until recently. I know the UN is going to have a conference in June in Geneva to try to get several representatives from these various sides together to begin to talk about that.
I'd just like to add that I think he raises a very crucial issue, because one thing that makes women very vulnerable to trafficking is the illegal status of prostitution. Because when they end up in the receiving country, the traffickers can use the illegal status of prostitution to limit the women accessing the police or getting help, because they say that what you're doing here is illegal. On top of your illegal work, you're an illegal migrant. How are you going to, you can't go anywhere and get help. So the illegal status of prostitution definitely adds to the marginalization of trafficked women and hence makes them more vulnerable to trafficking. The other thing is that women who are trafficked into, say, sweatshop labor or domestic service can potentially, if the traffickers are apprehended, and potentially try to get back wages. They can use the Fair Labor Standards Act, for example. However, for women who've been working in prostitution under abusive conditions, who haven't been paid, who've been held in debt bondage to prostitution, they have no means at all of trying to get any compensation for the time, all the work that they've done without any payment.
Right. Even the transmission of AIDS in the Nevada brothels is reduced, so that's another aspect of it.
Thank you. Next question, please.
My name is Ahongana. I am at the Harvard Medical School. My question is, the first speaker entailed two mechanisms of approaching or combating trafficking. Could you see education of the targeted communities, alerting the communities as a third mechanism? And given the abject poverty of most of these communities, how effective do you think that would be? And my second question is, you have talked about deportation and the financial consequences that it would entail on the deportees. Given the psychological or the cultural context of the extraction of these women, is there any mechanism also in place or being thought about to combat the psychological problems, the lifelong shame that deportation would bring about?
Yeah, okay, I'll take the education part first. I think definitely that mounting education programs in communities where women are vulnerable to traffickers is a very important step and needs to be done. But when you say that how effective would it be, our colleagues in Thailand, who've done extensive sociological work with victims of trafficking, they have come up with their experience is that the women who are most likely to be trafficked are not from the poorest echelon of society. In fact, they are from somewhat educated and sort of sort of lower middle echelons of society, and that the impetus to go overseas to seek employment is often to better the standard of life, meaning they've seen that, that they've seen how people have gotten television sets and consumer items, and so it's not really a question of basic survival or anything, it's just to improve the access to a lot of things that are now available. So it's hard to say whether it'll have a 100% success rate to increase education among targeted communities, but it's definitely a measure that needs to be worked on. And as for the deportation, when you mentioned the psychological impact, a lot of trafficking victims, most of them have severe psychological trauma, and that's why we say that among the services that must be provided to these victims is medical assistance, including psychological counseling and other kinds of, mental health help, assistance. So that's a very key part of the support services that victims of trafficking need to be provided.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Roger Falcon, and I'm a student at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. My question is in response or maybe a potential solution to the problem that was raised of the parents who sell their very small children into trafficking. And the Convention on the Rights of the Child holds that not only families but also states are responsible for protecting the best interests of the child, notwithstanding the fact that the U.S. is one of 2 countries in the world, along with Somalia, which has no government to do so, in not signing at this moment that convention. What are thoughts about the possibility of putting teeth into the state role in protecting the best interests in regards the trafficking of children?
Interesting question.
One of the things that is going on now, and we'll have to see where this ends, is there's a protocol being worked on that a couple of years in its making for an implementation on the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And one of the things that Representative Slaughter said before that's very important to listen to is that many countries around the world where there is trafficking have age of consent or sexual abuse issues where the girl can be as young as 12 or 14, even though the convention says 18. In the United States, if we talk about trafficking interstate, we're talking 18. So there are many countries that, while they have ratified the convention, do not partake in any of raising of the age limits to 16 even, let alone the 18 that's in the convention. These protocols are going to be a little bit more defined as to what some of the issues that groups can do. However, it is not a law enforcement protocol, and that's perhaps an important piece to realize, is that the convention is kind of a sense of where things should be, but it isn't a law enforcement protocol. I think one of the things we have to do is look back to those countries, because if you sell a child in the United States, and anyone finds out about it, you will be in jail for a very long time. Your child will hopefully be given to some home, to some parent, to someone with good counseling services and restitution for what has happened to it. Whether or not we can have other countries, I think all the issues that we've just been mentioning about whether they're the economic issues, getting states to do things on female genital mutilation as a model, those are very difficult things for us to say, how can we get another country to do it?
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Kate Quick, and I work in the Dean's Office at Radcliffe, and I'm also a graduate student in Women's Studies and Economics through the Extension School. And there have been some references to globalization as well as economic opportunity for women, and I'm wondering if there has been any empirical data on, as more countries are transitioning into capitalist economies, if that is seen as a factor in the increase in trafficking.
Who would like to answer that? Globalization.
I think the only example that I might be able to give, and I'm not even sure it's apt, but we do know that in Ukraine, as they are trying to transition, of course, all the countries of the former Soviet Union are in a very bad economic situation. That those women now have been freed up to leave the country really went off with all kinds of promise. Whether or not, and it's a point that did not materialize, the difficulty, I think, for us is we carry a very big stick. And I think both Marcia and I are trying to say we have to tread a little softly with that at times. We would like very much for everybody to raise the age to 18, but I know I saw just in the paper the other day a betrothed couple, age 2 and 4, I think. And while that is abhorrent to us, we have very little that we can do except try and moral suasion as we did with us. And you know, I'm sorry I haven't got more wonderful answers for you tonight. I've had nothing but frustration with this. But I do say one of the things that we have to do is we have to look at it for what it is. It is organized crime. And if it comes into the United States, by George, we are going to have to stop it. And I think that once we do that, that people who do other countries that we interact with. I think we'll learn by some example what we're doing is that that's not the way to go, and hopefully look at a new way to live and to bring up their children. Not that we are the ideal example, Lord knows, but at least when it comes, I think, to law enforcement, we know that when someone is held against their will and in bondage, there is some place for them to go. We were talking about legalizing it a while ago. I would imagine some of those women in this country would like nothing better than to see the police pull up to the door.
Did you want to add something? Sonia?
Just that, I mean, I don't have any empirical data, but I know that in Asia, there more and more people are trying to migrate out for employment since the economic crisis hit there. And by extension, one can infer that trafficking rates would probably be on the rise as well.
Thank you.
We have time for about, I think, 4 more questions, and then possibly some of the panelists will want to add a word. Yes.
Okay. I actually have 2 questions, but
Oh,
one is
okay.
one is
Two
kind
from
of
you
a,
and two from two other
What-
people.
one will be just a comment on the last few questions, which were economically oriented, and I think that in a lot of areas of the world that trafficking is happening to sort of lower middle class women because especially in the Ukraine, the advertisements often say, you know, bilingual women needed to be secretaries and yada, 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 and then they end up being coerced and their passports are taken away, as we were talking about before. But I think in Southeast Asia, from what little knowledge I have of this, that women are voluntarily going into prostitution and being trafficked, sort of knowing what they're going to do, but really not knowing what they're getting themselves into. In other words, not knowing that they're going to be in debt bondage, not knowing that they're going to have to sleep with, you know, such and such amount of men a day. And so I think it really is economically based. And the women that are going into it voluntarily are doing it because their families have no money and can't support them. So and they do it out of love for their families and out of thinking they're going to send money back to their families. Anyway, I just wanted
Your
to say.
question?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
May I comment on that for just a second?
yeah.
I don't think there's any evidence that indicates that they know what they're getting into.
No, they don't
That
know
they
what they're
really
getting.
believe that there's some work for them at the other end with some dignity to it. And for the most cases, we find that women who are so badly damaged from this experience that they can't go home again, as the other questioner pointed out.
Right.
But they don't have any. The problem, I think, is that since the world began, for some reason, women have been considered so cheap, something to be traded off or moved around. And the value of women is something that really needs to be instilled more and more. That your daughter is as valuable to you as your son, and not because you can sell her, but because she has the ability to grow up and to be as good as he.
Right.
And everything we're talking about really comes back down to that. Why is it in this world that women are considered to be commodities or just undervalued? And if we could solve that problem, a lot of the rest of these, I think, would really fall in line a whole lot easier.
Some of the women that we've spoken to in these international trafficking cases may know that they're going to be trafficked and that there will be some sexual activity. But that doesn't mean that they know the conditions
Right.
of
Right.
that sexual activity. That doesn't mean that they won't be given the freedom to leave.
Right.
That doesn't mean that there will be 20 people in an evening. That doesn't mean that there could be violence. That doesn't mean they won't be able to leave the room. So that's another piece of it. And I think that's a very important part for us to realize is the conditions more than. And that's why when we think about our laws, we don't necessarily need coercion. We don't necessarily need any of that because we're saying that the act itself often is deceptive and involves other activities.
Right.
Sonia.
Yeah, actually, I completely agree with your comment too and with what Marcia said. And that's why when I was saying that it's so hard to craft a response to this problem, this is precisely why, because you have victims with a whole range of experiences. And it's really hard to incorporate it all under one definition. And obviously, we have to maintain distinctions between migration and trafficking, between prostitution and trafficking. But exactly where those lines come down and how we do it has tremendous implications for the protections, human rights protections of women, and it becomes a very complex matter.
If you can hold your second question, yes.
My name is Shoshana Falik. I'm a student of international health at the School for Public Health. And my question is along the same lines about when coercion is not involved and when women are making this choice for economic opportunity, whether they know the consequences or they don't. How do you address that, either through legislation or education programs, assuming that we can make the assumption, I guess, that women wouldn't choose this if they do know the consequences? And then my second question is about cyberspace. And it was mentioned, but just sort of the prospects of regulating what's been going on, and sort of the increase of the sex trade in general because of the internet.
Who would like to look at what about the people who do have a
I'll say something
voluntary?
a bit about the second, that one of the characteristic features, not universal, but certainly characteristic features of child pornography is that overwhelmingly those who trade in the images are themselves users. That unlike some dimensions of the adult pornography industry, in the overwhelming instances in child pornography, one of the enormous purposes behind a fair amount of child pornography prosecution is that those who are prosecuted turned out themselves to be child abusers, child molesters, and the like. We've seen a quite dramatic increase in child pornography in cyberspace, the internet, and the like. One of the reasons, and Marcia can comment on this as well, is that for a substantial increase in the number of prosecutions is that not only has there been an increase in the trading internet, cyberspace, and the like in images, but usually the traders are themselves people who are doing things other than just at their computers.
You know, this area of cyberspace child pornography is really created a burgeoning business for us. It's keeping a lot of lawyers employed. And it is a very, very sorry state that so many people, so many investigators, and so many prosecutors, and so many defense attorneys are being so employed because it is just so prevalent and such easy access. And I think very often the individual who years ago may not have gone to the XXX bookstore because they were afraid they were going to get discovered, sits at home in great anonymity and thinks nothing of downloading child pornography, trading with someone else, much like guys used to trade baseball cards. They're trading child pornography pictures now. And one of the things you never know when you are sending a piece of child pornography is what's going to happen at the end, when the other person at the receiving end gets it. Are they going to show it to another child who then is going to be worn down and told, see how much fun the children in this picture are having? Let's have some of this fun too, so that it may facilitate the behavior of the pedophile on the other end of the computer. It may be another thing that gets a pedophile excited when he gets a new picture. He hasn't seen this one before. He may get excited and go out and molest another child. So the number of things that can happen when a person receives and sends a piece of child pornography is outstanding. And there's another type of phenomenon that has been created from this internet phenomenon, and that is the luring of youth through cyberspace, where people will go into chat rooms. And I don't know how many of you have been in chat rooms of very innocent natures, but there are some also non-innocent ones. And they will go also into teen chat rooms. Some of you may be parents who have had teenagers and they'll spend time. They'll go and they'll meet a pen pal, just like we used to have pen pals that you got and you wrote letters to. But instead you'll go into the chat room and work with them. But it may be that you can put up any profile you want, and you can lie about your age and who you are. And so you may think you're developing a real relationship with a child on the other end. But in fact, when you say, okay, you're coming to town with your family, I'll meet you at the mall, when you get to that mall and you think you're going to have you're a 16-year-old girl and you think you're meeting your 18-year-old boyfriend that you've had on internet, and the two of you are going to go have your first date and a tryst together, he turns out to be 35. So in fact, we have had a large number of these cases all across the country, and a lot of innocent children being set up in this way.
Maybe I'll take a stab at the first part of your question. You know, the reason you mentioned that some people may come in voluntarily, and that's why we always say that while improving protections for traffic victims, you also have to pay attention to improving labor practices across the board for all workers in, say, domestic service or, you know, in garment manufacturing. And even when it comes to prostitution, even if it's illegal, the human rights of prostitutes always have to be respected. And so if you know, so for example, debt bondage and other slavery-like conditions that shouldn't be tolerated in any labor situation, they need to be worked on concomitantly along with protection for trafficking victims. So that even, you know, voluntary people coming in or just normally migrant workers, there will be minimum labor protections for them.
Because I've wanted to allow a wide range of responses, I'm afraid our questions have gone on. I'm going to have to cut down and just say one more question. Maybe, you're probably not going to ask, so I'd like to sneak my own question in. Hasn't anybody ever said to you, well, isn't this just not just, it's obviously not just, but isn't there a piece of it that this is the rise of Puritanism again, the rise of some sort of Victorian issues again? Let me put that as a parenthesis and go to the last question.
Slavery. Well, I'll try to be brief. My name is Agnès Hubert. I'm the European Union Fellow at Fletcher, and more permanently, I'm an official of the European Commission in Brussels. As we are the 8th of March, I think we should sort of take stock every 8th of March and how we're progressing. And I'd like to put a little bit of an evolutionary note in the debate in a way. I mean, it was only 8 years ago I was involved in Brussels in proposing a legislation at European level on sexual harassment, which was minor matters in terms of what we're talking about here. I remember very well at the time, not only the press, but some ministers talking about that bottom pinching issue. I don't think this would be possible anymore, or I mean that would be seen in a very bad way even in Europe. And that, I think we've got to sort of take stock of this sort of progress in the mentalities. We've got to take stock as well of the progress. You were saying how much the issue is an American issue, domestic issue, and exactly the same tone has come up in a German and a French report recently saying, well, I mean, the question of trafficking, it happens here. It happens with people who go and work in Africa and sort of come back with a little Mauritian and use her in their sort of, as a domestic help and so on, but without any rights and so on. So this is another visibility and another progress which we've got to take stock of. I was very interested. I do thank thank you for organizing this talk, because I was very interested in knowing more about the protection project. Where I'd like to know more would be on when, as you're going along and when you sort of get the first results, what sort of strategy have you got as well for better informing people in the media, but not only here, as well in those countries that you're investigating? Is there any way where you're going to sort of reach out either through the media or other ways to get the information that's coming out of your project onto the people of the governments that you're sort of getting data from?
It's a very good question. We've talked a lot about how we'll disseminate and distribute the information, and we've promised every Ministry of Justice that participates in the survey access to the database and a copy of the final report, so that we see this is an incentive for them in some ways to participate, but also it's a way of us saying, we want you to be able to look at all the information that we collect and compare your laws to the other laws and pick and choose and find the laws that might be appropriate for you to tailor to your own country. We also, as I say, we know that some countries are not high-tech yet, and we want to find ways to distribute the information publishable form too, so pamphlets and the manual, the best legislative practices manual, and a couple of other things that we can mail to people who are not don't have access to computers. Finally, we have a 2-year timeline for the entire project, but we are planning to release the data as we tabulate it, so that we'll have ongoing reports. We're going to do the trafficking legislation first because everyone's very interested in that. We're doing the legislation on prostitution and surrounding activities next. We've done legislation on child pornography, and then finally we'll do the obscenity and pornography and the extradition and some of the other laws. And we'll publish these in clusters so that the data will be available. You can get the big reports, or you can get small policy briefings, and we'll hope to also have some policy briefings in Washington and here in Cambridge, and possibly in New York also as we go along. I'm not sure if it'll be quarterly, but it'll certainly be on a regular basis, and we're just getting ready to do that now.
Well, here it is, International Women's Day 1999. We've got these high-powered legislators, scholars, activists, lawyers working on this problem. That's great progress, right? And all of us here paying close attention to what's going on. And then you look at the problem and you think globalization coming around the corner, the internet, the problems seem to take off just as the energy and the intelligence and the commitment arises to go after them. So we're at quite a critical moment here. I'm glad the issue of progress was raised, because we're at a moment in which we don't know if we're making progress or not, but we've got to make progress because we have wonderful people like these working, and we have right on our side. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for coming.
Supposed to be individual questions now, Ed. Hey.
Thank you for raising that whole issue of progress. That was really an excellent way to. That's the networking of women working, and when I imagine us